It was a quiet evening in a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where soft music played in the background and people came to relax after a long day. A few tables were filled with friends chatting, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. In one corner of the cafe stood a small upright piano. It wasn't fancy or new, just an old instrument that had been there for years. Most people ignored it, but tonight it would become the center of something unforgettable. A man walked in, carrying himself with quiet confidence. He was tall, dressed neatly, and there was something about his posture that hinted he wasn't an ordinary person. His name was Daniel, a world-class pianist who had performed on some of the biggest stages around the world. He was used to applause, fame, and perfection. For him, music wasn't just an art, it was a discipline, something that demanded respect. That evening, Daniel wasn't there to perform. He simply wanted a quiet cup of coffee and some peace before another busy week of concerts. He sat near the window, ordered his drink, and took a deep breath. But as he waited, his attention was drawn to someone sitting a few tables away. It was a young woman, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a small notebook beside her. She looked ordinary at first, nothing that would make her stand out in a crowd. She wore a simple sweater, her hair tied back loosely, and she had that calm, thoughtful look of someone lost in their own world. But Daniel noticed something subtle, her fingers. They were gently tapping on the table, keeping rhythm as if she was hearing music that no one else could. He smiled a little. As a musician, he could always tell when someone had rhythm in their soul. He watched for a few minutes. She seemed to glance at the piano now and then, her eyes filled with a kind of quiet longing. Finally, Daniel leaned forward and said with a friendly tone, "You play?" The woman looked up surprised. Oh, not really," she said softly. "Just a little." Her voice was shy, almost unsure. But there was something about the way she said it that made Daniel curious. Musicians often hid behind those words just a little when they didn't want to draw attention. He smiled, lifting his cup slightly. "Just a little? That's how most great stories begin." She gave a small, nervous laugh. "Trust me, I'm not great. It's been a long time since I played." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. Something in her eyes told him there was more to her than she admitted. He decided to tease a bit. "How about you show me?" he said, gesturing toward the piano. Her expression changed instantly. She shook her head. "Oh, no. I couldn't. Not in front of people." "Come on," Daniel said kindly. "This isn't a concert. It's just a cafe. No pressure." She hesitated, glancing toward the piano again. The small crowd in the cafe had no idea what was happening. Some people noticed their conversation and turned to see what was going on. The soft hum of chatter faded as a few heads turned. Daniel stood up and walked toward the piano. "Tell you what," he said. "I'll play first. Then you can join me if you feel like it." Something about his confidence, or maybe the warmth in his tone, made her finally agree. She stood up slowly, still looking uncertain, and followed him. The crowd started paying attention now. It wasn't every day a professional pianist sat down to play in a small cafe. Daniel cracked his knuckles lightly, took a seat at the piano bench, and started to play. His fingers moved with grace and precision. Every note was clean, perfect, practiced. People clapped softly as the melody filled the cafe. It was smooth, elegant, and full of control, just what you'd expect from a professional. When he finished, he turned to her and smiled. "Your turn," he said. The woman froze for a second. "Oh, I really don't think..." But before she could finish, someone from the crowd said, "Come on, give it a try." A few others joined in, clapping encouragingly. She blushed and shook her head, but Daniel simply moved aside on the bench, making room. "No excuses now," he said with a grin. She took a slow breath and sat down beside him. Her hands hovered above the keys uncertainly. Daniel watched her carefully, expecting a simple tune, maybe something like "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" or a few basic chords. That's what people usually played when they said they knew a little. But the moment her fingers touched the keys, everything changed. At first, she played softly, as if testing the piano. The sound was gentle, hesitant. But then something shifted. Her expression changed, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands began to move more freely. Within moments, the notes began to flow like a stream, smooth and natural. The melody was rich with emotion, delicate yet powerful. The cafe fell silent. Even the barista stopped mid-step, holding a cup of coffee in the air. Daniel blinked in surprise. The tune she was playing wasn't simple at all. It was complex, layered, full of feeling. And she wasn't just copying a song, she was creating something alive. Every note had emotion behind it, like she was telling a story without using words. He leaned forward slightly, trying to see how her fingers moved. They danced across the keys with confidence and control. There were moments where she closed her eyes completely, lost in the music. The crowd was completely still, caught in the spell she had created. By the time she finished, no one moved for a few seconds. Then the room erupted into applause. People clapped and cheered, some even whistled. The woman looked startled, almost embarrassed by the attention. Her cheeks turned red as she smiled shyly and muttered, "Thank you." Daniel was the last one to clap. He just stared at her, speechless for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You call that playing a little?" She laughed softly. "I haven't played in a while," she said. "Who taught you?" he asked. She hesitated, her eyes softening. "My mother," she said. She loved music. We didn't have much, but she found me an old keyboard when I was little. It was missing a few keys, but I played on it anyway. She used to sit beside me and hum while I practiced. There was something in her voice, something tender and full of memories. Daniel didn't interrupt. He could tell this was more than just a hobby for her. She continued quietly. "When she got sick, I stopped playing for a while. It just didn't feel the same. But sometimes when I'm alone, I still play for her." Her words hung in the air like a soft note at the end of a song. Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest. For years he had performed for applause, for audiences, for perfection. But this woman had played for love, for memory, for something deeper. He finally said, "You don't just play music, you live it." She smiled faintly. "Music was always my way of keeping her close." Daniel nodded slowly. "You reminded me why I fell in love with piano in the first place," he said. She looked down, shyly smiling. "That means a lot. Thank you." The cafe slowly returned to its usual buzz, but people still whispered about what they had just witnessed. Some said they had never heard anything so moving. Others asked her name, but she just smiled and said it didn't matter. As she packed her things and prepared to leave, Daniel stopped her. "You know," he said, "you should play again, really play. The world deserves to hear you." She looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Maybe someday," she replied softly. Then she walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the evening crowd. Daniel sat back down at the piano and ran his fingers across the keys. They suddenly felt heavier than before. He realized that all his years of training and fame couldn't compare to the pure emotion she had shared in those few minutes. That night, the world-class pianist learned something new, that sometimes true talent doesn't come from years of practice or fame, but from a heart that's been through silence and still chooses to sing. The next day, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the cafe. The memory of that girl's playing kept replaying in his mind. Every note she had played still echoed somewhere deep inside him. He had spent years mastering techniques, memorizing compositions, and performing in grand halls before thousands of people. Yet nothing had touched him quite like that quiet moment in a small cafe, where a stranger had poured her soul into a few minutes of music. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a coincidence, that he was simply surprised because he hadn't expected anyone there to play so well. But that wasn't true. Deep down, he knew there was something more behind her music. It wasn't about skill. It was about heart. Her melody had carried emotion, joy, pain, love, and loss, all mixed together in a way that no amount of training could teach. That morning, while sitting at his piano at home, Daniel tried to play one of his usual pieces, but something felt off. His fingers moved perfectly, as always, but the sound felt empty. He stopped halfway, staring at the keys. For the first time in years, he realized that maybe he had been playing for the wrong reasons. He leaned back, thinking about her words. "I play for my mother." Those few words had more meaning than any applause he'd ever received. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself walking toward the same cafe again. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe he hoped to see her again. Maybe he wanted to hear her play once more. Or maybe he wanted to understand what it meant to play with true emotion. The cafe was quieter this time. A few regular customers were there, and the soft music in the background filled the air. The piano stood silently in the corner, just as it had the night before. Daniel ordered a coffee and sat at the same table near the window. He kept glancing toward the door, hoping she might walk in. Minutes turned into an hour and she didn't come. He smiled to himself, feeling a little foolish. She was probably just an ordinary girl who happened to love music, someone who didn't care about fame or attention. That thought made him respect her even more. Just as he was about to leave, the cafe owner walked up and said, "Hey, you're the pianist from last night, right? You and that girl. Wow, that was something. Haven't seen a crowd that happy in a long time." Daniel smiled politely. "Yeah, she was incredible. She comes here sometimes," the owner said. "Not often, though. She usually sits alone, writes in that little notebook of hers. Quiet girl, but kind. People like her." Daniel nodded. "Do you know her name?" The owner thought for a moment. "Lily, I think. Or something close to that," he smiled. The name suited her somehow. Soft, simple, but full of life, just like her music. For the next few days, Daniel kept visiting the cafe whenever he had time. He sat there quietly, sometimes reading, sometimes just thinking. A few people recognized him, but he didn't mind. He wasn't there to be admired. He was there for something else. Finally, on the fourth evening, he saw her again. She walked in quietly, just like before, her notebook in hand. She didn't notice him at first. She went straight to her usual table and ordered her coffee. Daniel hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over. "Hey," he said softly. She looked up, surprised, and then smiled politely. "Oh, hello. You're the pianist, right?" He laughed. "That's what they tell me." She smiled a little wider. "You come here often?" "Lately, yes," he said. "Mostly because I was hoping to run into you again." She looked surprised. "Me, why?" "Because I can't stop thinking about that music you played," he said honestly. "It wasn't just good, it was different, real." Her expression softened. "Thank you. That means a lot. Why would you play again?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "I don't know. I wasn't planning to." "Please," he said. "You might not realize it, but your music could inspire people." "It inspired me." She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "It's just, I play when I feel something. Not because I want to perform. I've never been comfortable playing for others." Daniel nodded, understanding. "I get that. But maybe that's exactly why your music feels so real. You're not trying to impress anyone." She smiled faintly. "I guess I just play what I feel." Daniel paused for a moment, thinking, "What if we play together this time?" She looked up, surprised. "Together?" "Yeah," he said. "Just for fun. No stage, no pressure. Just two people who love music." There was a long pause. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but only if you promise not to make it sound like a concert." He chuckled. "Deal." They walked over to the piano, and again the cafe began to quiet down. People recognized them from that night and started paying attention. Some smiled, whispering to each other, waiting for the magic to happen again. Daniel sat on the left side. She took the right. "You start," he said softly. "I'll follow your lead." She hesitated for a second, then took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes were soft and emotional, carrying a sense of warmth. Daniel listened carefully and joined in after a few bars, blending his melody with hers. At first, their styles clashed, his precise, practiced playing against her free, emotional flow. But within moments, something beautiful started to happen. Their music began to merge naturally, as if they had played together for years. His structured chords gave her melody a foundation, while her emotions gave his notes meaning. The audience sat still, completely absorbed. It wasn't a competition. It wasn't even a performance. It was a conversation, one made of sound instead of words. Every time she played a soft phrase, he answered with something gentle. Every time he added power, she balanced it with emotion. Daniel found himself smiling as he played. He hadn't felt this alive at the piano in years. It wasn't about being perfect anymore. It was about feeling, about connection. When the last note faded, the cafe erupted into applause again. But this time, Daniel didn't care about the clapping. He turned to her and said quietly, "That was beautiful." She smiled shyly. "It was fun. More than fun," he said. "It was honest." She looked at him curiously. "Honest?" "Yes," he said. "You play what's real." "I think I've been so focused on perfection that I forgot what that means." Her eyes softened. "Maybe music is supposed to feel, not impress." Daniel nodded. "You might be right." The cafe owner came over grinning. You two are amazing together. People love it. You should come back and play again sometime. Lily laughed gently. We'll see. When she left that evening, Daniel stayed behind, lost in thought. Watching her walk away, he realized that he had just learned something priceless. For years he had been chasing perfection, but she, with her quiet heart and soft smile, had reminded him that true art comes from imperfection, from feeling something deeply and letting it out without fear. That night he sat at his piano at home again, but this time he didn't open any sheet music. He just placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Not for fame, not for an audience, not even for himself. He played to remember what it felt like to be human, and for the first time in a long while his music had heart again. The next few days went by, but the cafe performance still stayed fresh in everyone's mind. People who had been there kept talking about it. Some even posted short clips online, and soon the small cafe became a spot people wanted to visit, just to see if those two pianists might play again. But Daniel and the young woman hadn't planned anything like that. For them, it wasn't about fame or views. It was about something much deeper, the way their music had connected that night. Daniel, however, couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she played, the emotion in every note, it wasn't something he could forget. He had been in music all his life, but never had he felt something so real. He realized that while he had mastered techniques and stages, she had mastered feelings, and that was what made her music unforgettable. One afternoon, Daniel decided to visit the cafe again. He had no concert scheduled that day, and something inside him told him to go. Maybe she'd be there again. When he entered, the place was busier than usual. A few people recognized him and whispered excitedly, but he didn't mind. He just scanned the room, and there she was, sitting by the window, her little notebook open, pen in hand. She was writing something, lost in thought. He walked over slowly. You writing another song? He asked softly. She looked up, startled at first, then smiled when she saw him. Maybe I just write down feelings sometimes. Not always music, just thoughts. That's a beautiful habit, he said, taking the seat across from her. Most people talk to others. You talk to your notebook, she laughed lightly. It listens better than people do. Daniel smiled. I believe that. For a while they just talked. Not about music, but about life. She told him how her mother used to encourage her to express feelings through music, even when things were hard. Daniel listened quietly, fascinated by how much depth there was behind her calm personality. After some time, she said, I never thought I'd play in front of people again. That night I almost walked away when you asked me. He leaned forward. What made you stay? She paused, thinking. Maybe your confidence. Or maybe I just wanted to remember how it felt to play again. I didn't expect anyone to listen. Well, he said with a gentle smile, you made everyone listen. Even the coffee machine stopped that night. She laughed again, shaking her head. You're exaggerating. I'm serious, Daniel said. You didn't just play a song. You told a story without words, and I've been trying to figure out how to do that for years. She looked at him curiously. But you're already a professional. You play on the biggest stages. He sighed softly. Yes, but sometimes when you do something for so long, you forget why you started. I think I lost that feeling somewhere along the way. But you reminded me. Her expression softened. Maybe we all forget sometimes. Music should come from the heart, not from fear of making mistakes. He nodded slowly. Exactly. For a moment they sat in silence, both lost in thought. Then, out of nowhere, a voice from another table called out, Hey, are you two going to play again today? A few heads turned. Some of the regular customers smiled, hoping for another performance. Daniel looked at her questioningly. What do you say? She hesitated. I don't know. We didn't plan anything. He stood up with a grin. Then let's not plan. Let's just play. She shook her head, laughing. You really don't give people a chance to say no, do you? Not when I know it'll be worth it, he replied. A few minutes later, they were sitting side by side at the piano again. The small crowd in the cafe started to quiet down, waiting eagerly. Daniel whispered, Let's start simple. Follow your heart and I'll follow you. She nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. Then her fingers touched the keys. The first few notes floated softly through the room. Her melody was different this time, gentle, full of warmth, but also touched with something sad and beautiful. Daniel joined in after a few moments, letting his chords blend with hers. It was as if two stories were being told at the same time. Hers full of emotion and reflection, his steady and structured guiding her melody forward. Together they created something magical. People in the cafe stopped whatever they were doing. The chatter faded, cups paused mid-air, even the background music was turned off. The two of them were lost in their world where only the music existed. At one point she closed her eyes completely. Her hands moved faster, expressing something powerful. A burst of memory or emotion that words could never capture. Daniel followed her lead, matching her energy with his own skill, lifting the melody higher. The music swelled, then softened, then rose again like waves in the ocean. It was no longer a performance. It was a conversation between two souls. One speaking in emotion, the other replying in harmony. As the final notes faded, silence filled the cafe. For a few long seconds, no one clapped, no one moved. It was as if everyone needed a moment to return to reality. Then suddenly the room erupted with applause. The crowd stood cheering, clapping, some even wiping away tears. The energy in the room was electric. The cafe owner rushed forward with a huge smile. "That was incredible," he said. "You two are magic together." Daniel smiled, still catching his breath. "It's all her," he said, gesturing toward her. She blushed, shaking her head. "It's both of us," the owner laughed. "Whatever it is, it's something special. You should do this every week." The audience agreed instantly, clapping louder, shouting, "Yes!" and "Encore!" Daniel turned to her and asked softly, "What do you think?" She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Maybe once in a while," she said. "Not every week." "That's good enough for me," he said warmly. As the crowd slowly returned to normal conversation, a few people came up to thank them personally. Some said the music made them feel calm. Others said it brought back old memories. One older man even said, "I lost my wife a few years ago. For a few minutes, your music made me feel like she was here again." That touched both of them deeply. It reminded them why music mattered, because it could heal people in ways nothing else could. After everyone left, Daniel and the woman stayed behind, sitting quietly at the piano. The cafe was almost empty now, the lights softer. "That was something else," Daniel said softly. She nodded. "It felt different tonight. Like every note meant something." He turned to her. "That's because you played from the heart again. That's what makes you special." She smiled gently. "You too. I think you've found your heart again, haven't you?" He looked down at the keys and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I have." For a long time, neither of them said anything. They just sat there listening to the faint sound of the city outside. Cars passing, people talking, life moving on. But for them, it felt like time had slowed down. Before leaving, she said quietly, "Music connects people who might never have met otherwise." "I'm glad I met you," he smiled. "I'm glad too." When she walked out of the cafe that night, Daniel watched her go, just like before. But this time he felt something different. A quiet inspiration. A kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. He knew their paths might not cross often. But he also knew something important. Sometimes, a single meeting can change the way you see everything. That night, as he sat alone at his grand piano, he didn't open any sheet music. He just closed his eyes and started to play the same melody they had shared. It sounded softer in the silence of his apartment, but it carried the same feeling, the same truth. He realized something powerful in that moment. Perfection could never move people, but honesty always could. And that night, in that tiny cafe, he had rediscovered what it truly meant to make music. Not for applause, not for fame, but simply for the love of it. A few weeks passed since that night when Daniel and the young woman played together again. The cafe had become a little more crowded these days, filled with people who hoped to hear that magical piano duet once more. But Daniel and the woman hadn't planned anything since then. They both went back to their lives, she with her quiet world of notebooks and memories, and he with his concerts and busy schedule. Yet something had changed for both of them. For Daniel, performing on grand stages didn't feel the same anymore. Each time he sat down to play in front of hundreds of people, he found himself thinking about that small cafe, the warm light, and the emotion that had filled the air when she played. It wasn't the applause he missed. It was the feeling of honesty. On stage, he often felt distant, almost mechanical, as if his fingers played perfectly but his heart stayed silent. He realized that fame could fill halls, but not hearts. One evening after finishing a show, he returned to his dressing room. There were flowers, letters, and praises waiting for him, but they didn't bring the joy they once did. He sat in silence for a while, then picked up his phone and scrolled through the cafe owner's number. Without overthinking, he sent a short message. "Will she be there tomorrow?" The reply came a few minutes later. "She comes sometimes. You might get lucky." The next day, Daniel showed up at the cafe again. It was afternoon and the sun poured in through the windows, giving the whole place a golden glow. The piano sat quietly in the corner, waiting. He ordered a coffee and sat near the window, just like before. He didn't know if she would come, but deep inside he hoped she would. After about half an hour, he heard the familiar sound of soft footsteps. He turned, and there she was, walking in with her small notebook, her hair tied loosely and that same calm expression. She noticed him almost immediately and smiled. "You again?" she said playfully. He laughed. "Guilty. I was hoping to see you." She took a seat across from him. "You must really like this cafe." "Maybe," he said, smiling. "But I think it's more about the company." She laughed softly. "Flattery from a world-class pianist? That's rare," Daniel shrugged lightly. "Not flattery. Just honesty." They talked for a while, sharing small things, how their week had been, how the cafe had become unexpectedly popular, and how people still asked about that magical performance. She seemed surprised when he told her how much people had admired her. "I wasn't even trying," she said, shaking her head. "I just played what I felt." "That's exactly why it worked," he said gently. "You played with heart. Most of us forget to do that." There was a quiet pause. Then she said something that made Daniel look at her more closely. "You know, I didn't just play for fun that night. I played for someone." He tilted his head slightly. "Your mother?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, she was the one who taught me music. But she passed away a few years ago. I stopped playing for a long time after that. I couldn't even look at a piano without thinking of her. It hurt too much." Daniel stayed silent, giving her space to speak. "I used to practice on an old keyboard that barely worked." She continued softly. She would sit beside me, humming while I played. Even when the keys got stuck or the sound was off, she always smiled. She used to say, "Music doesn't come from your hands, it comes from your heart." Her eyes glistened as she spoke. After she was gone, I just couldn't find that feeling anymore. Everything felt empty. I thought I'd lost my music for good. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had played in front of royalty, on television, in world-famous halls. But in that small cafe, hearing her speak, he realized he had never witnessed something this pure. "I think," he said softly, "you never lost it. You just needed a reason to find it again." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, and you reminded me that I still could." Daniel smiled, though his eyes were heavy with emotion. "You did the same for me. You made me remember why I started playing in the first place." There was silence again, but it wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, like two people quietly understanding something words couldn't explain. After a while, she said, "Do you ever get tired of it? The fame, the shows, the pressure?" He sighed deeply. "All the time. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing for applause, not for love. It's strange. People think success means happiness, but it doesn't always. Sometimes I miss being unknown, playing just because it made me feel alive." She nodded slowly. "That's the thing about music. It's supposed to make you feel alive, not exhausted." Daniel smiled at her wisdom. "You sound like a teacher," she chuckled. "Maybe someday I will be. I've been thinking about teaching kids who can't afford lessons. My mother used to say everyone deserves music in their life." He looked at her, genuinely impressed. "That's a beautiful dream." She smiled softly. "Dreams don't have to be big. They just have to be kind." That sentence stayed with Daniel. As the evening light dimmed, a few people in the cafe started whispering again, hoping they'd play. Daniel looked at her and said gently, "One more time?" She hesitated, but then smiled. "All right, but this time you follow me," he grinned. "Deal!" They sat at the piano, side by side once again. The room fell quiet as she began to play. This time her melody was slow, filled with warmth and nostalgia. It sounded like a memory coming to life. Daniel joined in softly, matching her rhythm, letting her lead the way. Together they painted a story through sound, a story of loss, love, healing, and rediscovery. Her notes spoke of her mother, and his chords wrapped around hers like comfort. It was raw, emotional, and breathtakingly beautiful. When the final note faded, there wasn't a single dry eye in the cafe. People sat silently, some holding their hands over their hearts. The applause came late, but when it did, it was deep and full of emotion. She looked at Daniel, her eyes wet but shining. "That one was for her," she whispered. He nodded. And I think she heard it. After the performance, people came up to thank them again. One woman said, "I lost my father recently. Your music made me feel like I was speaking to him again." "Thank you." That moment touched them both deeply. It showed them that music could heal not just themselves, but others too. When the cafe emptied and the lights dimmed, they sat there a little longer, either wanting the night to end. "You know," Daniel said quietly, "you have something special. Not just talent, something deeper. You reach people." She looked down, smiling shyly. "Maybe that's all I ever wanted to do." He thought for a moment, then said, "How about we make it more than just one cafe? What if we perform somewhere else together? Not for fame, but for good. For people who need hope." She looked surprised. "You mean like charity concerts?" "Yes," he said. "We could use music to help others. Hospitals, orphanages, schools, and anywhere people need a little light." Her eyes lit up. "I'd love that." And just like that, something new began between them. Not romance, not business, but a shared purpose. Two people from different worlds connected through something pure. That night, as Daniel walked home under the soft city lights, he felt lighter than he had in years. He didn't feel like a performer anymore. He felt like a person who had rediscovered his heart. Meanwhile, she sat at home, looking at her old keyboard. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, whispering, "I hope you heard that, Mom." The broken keys still made soft, uneven sounds, but to her, it was the most beautiful music in the world. That night, both of them, in their own quiet spaces, realized that music wasn't just sound. It was emotion, memory, and connection. It was something that healed both the player and the listener. And for the first time in a long while, they both felt truly at peace. Months passed since that unforgettable night in the cafe. Life had moved forward, but something had changed deeply for both Daniel and the young woman. They were no longer just strangers who shared a piano. They had become partners in purpose, carrying the same dream, to bring music where it was needed most. Daniel, once known only for performing in grand halls and luxury theaters, began to spend more time in small, quiet places, children's hospitals, care homes, schools in poor areas. Each place had its own story, its own pain, and he played not for fame, but for healing. And every time he did, the young woman was there beside him, adding her warmth to every melody. Their first charity concert was held in a small community center on the edge of town. The stage was simple, just a plain wooden floor and a piano that looked older than both of them combined. The lights flickered slightly and the chairs were mismatched. But when they began to play, none of that mattered. The audience wasn't made of critics or reporters, it was made of people who needed comfort. There were tired workers, single parents, children who had seen too much too early. When the first note filled the room, everyone went silent. And when they finished, the crowd stood in tears, clapping not for perfection but for emotion. After the show, an old man approached them slowly. He carried a small photo in his hand and said, "That song reminded me of my wife. She passed away years ago, but for a few minutes tonight, I felt like she was right here beside me again." The woman smiled softly and said, "That's what music is meant to do. It brings back the people we love, even if just for a little while." The man nodded, holding her hand gently, and whispered, "Don't ever stop playing." That night, when they left the hall, Daniel looked up at the stars and said, "It's strange. I've played in front of thousands, but I've never felt this alive." She smiled. "That's because you're finally playing for something real." Their small performances soon began to spread through word of mouth. People started inviting them to schools, shelters, and even small villages where children had never seen a live piano before. Every time they played, it wasn't about fame, it was about connection. In one small school, they met a boy who couldn't speak but loved to draw. When he heard the piano, he sat quietly and began sketching. After the show, he came up and handed them a small drawing. It showed a piano surrounded by stars. Daniel looked at it for a long time before saying, "This is the best gift anyone's ever given me." The young woman smiled and said, "See? Music speaks even when words can't." Each performance changed them both in small but powerful ways. Daniel began writing new music not for competitions or recordings, but for people who couldn't afford concert tickets. He started composing simple tunes that children could play on old keyboards or even on tablet apps. He said music belongs to everyone. It shouldn't need a ticket. She, on the other hand, started teaching. True to her mother's dream, she began giving free piano lessons to kids from poor families. Every Sunday, she would gather them in the same cafe where it all began. The owner had happily offered the space, saying, "You two brought life back to this place. It's the least I can do." Those Sundays became the heart of her week. The sound of small hands on piano keys filled the cafe, mixed with laughter and mistakes and joy. She never scolded them for wrong notes. She always said, "A wrong note played with love is better than a perfect one played without feeling." Daniel often stopped by those lessons, sometimes to help, sometimes just to listen. Seeing her teach reminded him of why he started this journey. The cafe that once held their first duet had now become a place of hope for many. One evening after the kids had gone home, Daniel and the woman sat by the window. The light from the street lamps fell softly on their faces. "Do you ever miss the big stage?" she asked. He thought for a moment, then said, "Sometimes, but only when I forget what really matters. The stage gave me applause, but this—" He gestured around the quiet cafe. "This gives me peace," she smiled. "Maybe peace is worth more than applause," he nodded. "You're right. It is." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts. The world outside buzzed with life, cars passing, people laughing, but inside the cafe it felt calm. After a while, she looked at the piano and said softly, "Do you think your fans ever wonder where you disappeared?" He chuckled. "Maybe, but I think the ones who really understand music would know I didn't disappear. I just found a different stage." The woman laughed quietly, her eyes warm. "That's a beautiful way to put it." A few months later, something unexpected happened. A video of one of their performances went viral online. Someone from the audience had recorded it and shared it with the caption, "Two strangers playing for love, not fame." The video spread quickly. People from all over the world commented how it made them cry, how it reminded them of hope and kindness. Soon, reporters and show organizers began reaching out asking for interviews and performances. But Daniel refused most of them. He said, "If I go back to that world, I might lose what I found here." Still, one day he got an invitation from a major music festival, a place where he used to perform every year before he took his break. This time, though, the invitation was for both of them. At first, she hesitated. "That's not my world," she said. "I'm not a professional," Daniel smiled. "Neither was I once. But talent doesn't belong to a world, it belongs to people who feel." She finally agreed, and they decided to perform one song together, the same piece they first played at the cafe. When the day came, the hall was packed with thousands of people. The lights were blinding, the stage massive. For a moment she felt nervous looking at the sea of faces. But Daniel whispered, "Just pretend we're back in the cafe. Just you, me, and the piano." She took a deep breath and smiled. When they started playing, the sound filled the hall like magic. Every note carried emotion, every pause carried meaning. It wasn't just music, it was a story. A story of two people who met by chance, found healing through sound, and shared it with the world. The crowd was completely silent until the final note faded. Then, as if the spell had broken, thunderous applause erupted. People stood cheering and crying. But Daniel didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her with pride, gratitude, and quiet joy. She looked back, her eyes shining, and for a moment, they both understood something words could never say. When they walked off stage, Daniel said, "That might have been the best performance of my life." She laughed softly, because it was real. That night, when they left the festival hall, they didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The world had just witnessed their story, but for them, it was still just about two people who loved music for what it truly was, a language of the soul. Back in the cafe, days later, everything looked the same. The piano, the soft lights, the smell of coffee. She sat down at the piano and began to play quietly. Daniel listened from a nearby table, smiling. The notes drifted through the air, gentle and warm. A few customers stopped to listen. The cafe owner smiled from behind the counter, shaking his head softly as if he still couldn't believe how it all started. As the last note faded, Daniel walked up and said, "You know, when I first saw you here, I thought you were just a waitress." She smiled teasingly. And now? He grinned. Now I think you're the best teacher I've ever had. She laughed, but there was emotion behind it. Funny. I could say the same about you. Outside, the night was calm. Inside, the piano stood as a silent witness to everything that had happened. The meeting, the challenge, the discovery, the healing. And somewhere deep in their hearts, they both knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of many more songs waiting to be played. Because sometimes, life's most beautiful music doesn't come from talent or fame. It comes from two souls brave enough to listen to each other's hearts.